Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. This is a passage that we're very familiar with, and we enjoy hearing on Easter Sunday, on Resurrection Sunday. We love to hear about the stone that is rolled away and about the risen Lord. And it is good that we can be here together and rejoice together in that fact that the Lord has risen. But sometimes I think what we want to do is we want to go from the agony and the torture of the crucifixion on Saturday and jump straight to the resurrection. But that's not what we have in this passage. What we have is we have Mary coming in the dark and full of emotion and wanting to be there, and then we see her weeping. And I think we don't want to forget what we see here. We don't want to overlook the emotion that we have and the time that we have with Mary here. As we look at the different gospel accounts, the other three all include other women, that there were more women there at the tomb. But John chooses to focus strictly on Mary. And I think he does that for a reason, and we want to honor that. Is that she comes in the dark, very early in the morning. And we have seen in John that the dark, lots of people that mean a lot. There's a big contrast between the dark and the light of Jesus. Nicodemus comes at night to see Jesus, and he is confused and he does not understand. When Judas leaves the community of the disciples to go and betray the Lord, he does it at night. And here we see that Mary is in the dark, and she doesn't fully understand. And I think sometimes we can relate to that. That sometimes I'm in the dark and I don't fully understand everything. But as we look at this, we see that we have a bad beginning. We have her coming in the dark, that Jesus has been crucified, and everything looks dim. And then God acts, and everything changes. We see that throughout the Bible. You go back to the very first page of the Bible, and you see that it was dark, and there was chaos, and then God spoke, and God acted, and everything changed. And that goes on. You know, Sarah and Abraham. Sarah's 90, Abraham's 100, and they have no children. And they are depressed, and they have sadness in their lives. But then God acts, and everything changes. And then we have a child. Isaac is born, and we have the children of Israel come to be, which gives us David, the line of David, which leads to Jesus. That God acted, and everything changed. We see those children of Israel end up in Egypt, in slavery. And they cry out to the Lord in their grief and their distress and their oppression. And God hears them, and God acts, and everything changes. They go from being enslaved to being free people with their own nation. And we look at that nation, and they end up in exile in Babylon. The invaders come and take them, and they take them in, and they kill lots of people. Their country is destroyed. Their city is leveled, and they are crying out to the Lord in exile. But God acts, and everything changes. And they get to go home. And we see in this story that we see Mary there with her weeping, and she is upset and oppressed, and then God acts, and everything changes. When we look at this story, there are lots of almost comical aspects to it. It's when Mary goes and she sees the stone roll away. What does she do? She assumes that someone has taken the body. There's no evidence that anybody's taken the body because all she sees is the stone is rolled away, but she assumes that. And she runs to tell Peter and the other disciple. We've seen throughout John that people make assumptions and they don't understand. And then they grow. And they may learn to understand. Go back to in the second chapter at the temple. And Jesus tells them, tear this temple down and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And they don't understand at that time that he's talking about his body. But the Bible tells us that they will understand. That it is a progression, that you grow. That is something that is a comfort to each of us, because none of us know it all. We all need to struggle at times to learn, to grow. And we see that in the book of John. And I don't know why we have the story about who's fastest. I'm sure there's some significance there, but the disciple that Jesus loved, who most people think is John, is very clear that he outran Peter. And I don't know exactly why. But then he tells us again that even though he got there first, that he goes in second. It's very important that we understand that he's faster than Peter. But when they get there and they go in and they see the cloths, they see the clothes, they see that Jesus is gone. And it says that the disciple that Jesus loved believed when he went in. But then what do? They go home. That we have this situation that they've come, they've seen that Jesus is no longer there, the stone's been rolled away and he's not there. Jesus has told them over and over that he will arise. And they go home. We see later in the chapter they're kind of huddled up in the house, waiting. They don't know what to do. But Mary is a little bit different, isn't she? They go home, but Mary is still there. It tells us that Mary looks into the tomb, and what does she see? She sees 2 angels sitting there. Angels sitting where Jesus had been laid. Now when you read the Bible and you look at many of the aspects, you see over and over that when people see angels, what's their number one reaction? They're terrified. And why wouldn't they be? If an angel shows up, usually something's going on in there, an angelic being, and you are terrified. But Mary does not do that, does she? She just speaks to him and goes on. She is so concerned with the fact that Jesus is missing that she doesn't even get afraid of angels. When we look at Mary, she's interesting. We don't know a lot about her. But we do know that Luke tells us that back in Luke 8:3, soon afterward he went on through the cities and villages proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. We see here that Mary had met Jesus before, that he had cast demons out of her, and that she was one of his followers and his disciples, and she is one of those who contributed to the disciples and his welfare, gave them money so that they could support themselves. I think sometimes we overlook that ministry. And I know that we are a small congregation and that we may have limited impact sometimes. But I want to compliment this congregation on your willingness to do just like this, to give up your means to help those who need it. And I think that we should be, it is a ministry. Even though we may not be in Ukraine, we help to provide some help for refugees, even though we aren't there. And even though we may not be other places, at times we do what we can to give what we can. And I want to compliment the generous hearts that are within this congregation when we look at this. But Mary is one of those. We also see that Mary was there at the cross when Jesus was crucified. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. There aren't many disciples there, but Mary is one of those that is at the cross. And then she is up early in the dark on that first day of the week to go to that tomb. She wanted to do what she could. But as we look at this passage, John tells us 4 times in 4 verses that Mary was weeping. He emphasizes that, and it must be, I think he had a reason for doing that, to show her distress and destroy how grieving she was by her weeping. He tells it over and over and over and over again. I think one of the reasons he tells us that he points out her grief and her weeping, is to show that she's like us. That there is emotion in the gospel. That there is grieving sometimes. There is. We all know that. Life is full of grief. Everyone in this building has suffered grief. Everyone. We've lost loved ones. We've had other things that have happened. And we've experienced grief. When I was reading this passage and preparing for this lesson, it reminded me of a friend. Many of y'all knew him. Stevie Altman down in Memphis. He ran Mike's Farm Supply for many years. And then before that, he worked with Wiley Davis and other things. But Stevie got COVID a little over a year ago and got it bad. And he ended up down in Wichita in the hospital. He was in a coma for, a month, 6 weeks. He finally starts to get better. And he wakes up and he can communicate and he is getting better. But then it levels off. And at one point, they tell him, you're never going to live without a ventilator. And he did not want to live that way. And he made the decision to take the ventilator off. And he died a few minutes later. And his wife, Teresa, obviously grieved. His children grieved. And that was a very, very much a heartfelt thing. I'm not trying to say that their grief is more than anyone else's. It was just that that's one of the things that I thought of. One of the things that Teresa did in trying to overcome her grief or put it behind is she painted a picture. And it's a self-picture of her and her grief. And it was one of the ways that she was trying to let the grief go. And when we look at Mary in this passage and we see her so full of grief, I think we can relate to that as humans. And we see that she's not paying attention to angels. She comes out and she sees this guy that she thinks is the gardener, and she speaks to him, and he speaks back to her. Says, "Woman, why are you weeping?" But she doesn't recognize him. She does not recognize him until he says, "Mary." And when Jesus calls her by name, then she recognizes him. When we see the Lord calling someone by name, we look at the Good Shepherd passage back in John 10. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Mary knew the Lord's voice. And when he called her by name, she recognized him, and she clung to him. And he says, "Don't cling to me. I have not yet ascended. Go tell." When we look at this, we see that Jesus called her by name and she recognized him. But we also see that he gave her an assignment. That he calls her by name and then he says, go. Go and tell. And that's one of the things that we see amongst us today. We see that good news, that incredible good news, that the Lord rose. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shined in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That Christ is the light, and even death could not put that light out. That darkness did not overcome it. And just as he called Mary's name and gave her an assignment, he's also calling our name today. He is calling each one of us. And then once we accept Christ, everything changes. Just like all the way through the Bible, everything changes. Because we go from being alone, maybe in our grief, or maybe just in alone, to being part of a family. To being part of Jesus' family, Christ's family. And that is what he's offering, is to come. But he also has an assignment for us. It's never just come and sit. It is always come and go. Come and do. And we recognize that Jesus has done so much for us. I don't think we all recognize what he has done. But he's also calling us to go and do. And when we look at Psalms, this is Psalm 116. It tells us, what shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? And when we look at Mary, and Jesus said to her, don't cling to me. Maybe we look at our own lives, and is there something we need to let go? Is there something that we need to quit clinging to? Maybe it is the past. We all have stuff in our past that we wish was not there, but we do. Maybe it is our guilt that we have over something. Maybe it is something that we know that we need to let go of and come to Christ, to render to Christ, to the Lord, what is his. We have the wonderful good news that Christ arose. We have it here that we rejoice on Easter morning. But we also have that invitation of him calling our name. When he calls each of us by name to come to him, that we may have life with him. Life and life abundant. That is our lesson today. And we want to make that offer. As a congregation to you, as a people, that if you will come to the Lord, everything changes. And we want to, if you need comfort, if you need prayers, if you need just to be part of us, we would gladly want to be there for you. If you would come while we stand and as we sing.